What do you see to a remedy of that to hold governments accountable for their actions abroad besides the ballot box?
Well,
Um, do you envision anything that could at least rein in some governments?
well, I mean, certainly every other Western industrial state sought and obtained the repatriation of its citizens from Guantanamo Bay. I think those governments experienced varying degrees of political pressure to do it, but they acted.
Yeah.
Um, I think it would be desirable if courts of law would take more seriously the need to provide an effective remedy. And some courts have, some lower courts have. The first level of court that heard Omar Khadr's case with respect to the request for repatriation, I think made a very legally sound and appropriate and courageous decision. That decision was even upheld by the Federal Court of Appeal, but the Supreme Court of Canada ducked on the most important question of remedy. So some courts, I think, have stepped up. Certainly courts in other jurisdictions have stepped up. It's a difficult, certainly the situation of the duties that Canada owes citizens abroad is a difficult legal question. In Omar's case, it was made less difficult by the affirmative steps that Canada had taken to piggyback on U.S. violations. It would have been a more difficult case in law had the Canadian government simply sat on its hands throughout and done nothing. More difficult, but I still think not insurmountable. But in the actual circumstances of Omar's case, Canada had actively become complicit in the Guantanamo Bay regime.
Thank you. I realize Omar's situation is fairly sensitive now because he is in the process at some stage to be transferred to prison in Canada. Keeping in mind that sensitivity, what are the prospects of his future? Do you
Well,
see?
part of that will depend on what kind of prison he is transferred to in Canada. Certainly, the reports of those who observed Omar at close range, consistently, over time, are all unanimous that he is somebody who is a very good candidate for rehabilitation and reintegration. They speak positively of him. There is, of course, a constituency in Canada that is deeply committed to portraying him as a monster, as a terrorist, as a pariah, as somebody who was, is, and will always be a menace to Canada. That does not appear to be the view of those who have seen him most closely, most often for the longest period of time. And these are often people who you can imagine as, for example, guards and military police, have no particular motive to speak positively of Omar, and indeed don't speak positively of other detainees. So one day, one way or another, Omar Khadr will have to be released. It is in everybody's interest, Omar's interest for sure, but in the Canadian society's interest as well, that he be that he have access to the best forms of rehabilitation and reintegration available. And that's in everybody's interest. The sooner that happens, and the better that process, the better off everybody will be. I think he is currently undertaking education. He's doing correspondence courses. He's trying to educate himself. He is a man who's spent over a third of his life in Guantanamo Bay. But having said all of that, the people who know him the best think that there is reason to be optimistic about his potential to be a functioning person in society, and we should facilitate rather than impede that through a kind of bloodlust or vengeful
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah, hopefully that doesn't happen in this country or North America for that matter. that would make it even more tragic, in my opinion. I'm thinking about when he was first incarcerated. This is a final note here, but I'm thinking about when he was first captured by the U.S. military. That in itself, he was a prisoner of war, wasn't he?
Well, Omar Khadr, there's several things. Omar Khadr was 15 years old when he was captured.
Yeah.
So he was a juvenile. But at no point has he been treated as somebody who warrants treatment specific to the fact that he was 15 years old when he was captured. Whether you understand him as a child soldier, a young offender, whatever, there's certainly at no point was he ever regarded as such and treated as such, contrary to the sorts of requirements that would be imposed were he, for example, a criminal accused in Canada or the United States, or indeed recognized as a child under international law. Moreover, Omar, as with all of the other alien, unlawful enemy combatants, or now alien, unprivileged, unprivileged enemy combatants in Guantanamo Bay, has never been accorded prisoner of war status. He and the other detainees have occupied a zone that is the worst of all possible worlds. So he was not understood as a prisoner of war. Prisoners of war can be detained until the end of hostilities, but on the other hand, they can't be tried for murder because they have what's called combatant's privilege. But if they are unlawful combatants, even so under the laws of war, and they can be tried for murder, then in being tried for murder, they are subject to all of the procedural protections and evidentiary rules that guide criminal prosecutions. He had none of that either. And indeed, under criminal law, if somebody's tried for murder, if, for example, Omar Khadr was to be tried for killing a U.S. soldier by throwing a grenade, then if he was convicted, he was entitled to be sentenced and then released after a sentence. If he was acquitted, he was entitled to be released. The position of the U.S. government has always been, it doesn't matter if Omar or any of the other detainees are acquitted of the offenses with which they've been charged. They can be detained indefinitely as unprivileged enemy combatants. So it's kind of the heads I win, tails you lose model, where they are treated as a prisoner of war for purposes of detaining them indefinitely, but treated as criminal accused insofar as they are charged with offenses that would not exist if they were regarded as combatants. And even if acquitted of those offenses, in any event, they'll be detained indefinitely, or could be. So it was a regime that never fit within existing laws of war, existing criminal law. It simply was this, what one might call this zone of exception.
Yeah, unbelievable. It sounds like it's fortunate that at least he could be on his way home soon.
Let's hope he is on his way home soon.
Yeah, exactly. You never know what could happen, eh? Would you say the prospects are pretty good? That it sounds like he will be coming back, but you never know, right?
You know, one way or another, Omar Khadr is coming back to Canada.
Yeah.
And the reason I can say that with certainty is that even if the government delays in repatriating him, again, because perhaps for reasons of political advantage, fact is that Omar Khadr is an alien, that is a non-citizen in the United States. And certainly the United States could decide, as it can with any non-citizen, to deport him. And if the United States decides to deport Omar Khadr to Canada, there's nothing Canada can do about it. Canada is obliged to accept one of its citizens. In theory, then Canada can drag its heels and the United States can simply deport Omar Khadr to Canada and dump him on the tarmac. Now, it makes no sense for Canada to will that event into existence. It makes sense for everybody from every side to have a structured form of return. So, I don't know, again, other than a kind of appeal to a kind of vengeful mentality that perhaps the government understands as an important constituency that it wants to both pacify and cultivate. I can't see any reason why it would put up serious obstacles to Omar's return. But ultimately, I think probably the most important factor will be the pressure that the United States brings to bear on the Canadian government to fulfill the terms of its undertaking. Omar has fulfilled the terms of his undertakings under the plea agreement.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Macklin, for sharing your insights on Omar's saga, and it sounds like Canada's own saga, dealing with fundamental rights of its citizens. Hopefully this is something that will be addressed in the future, and citizens can rely on their government for protections and services while they're overseas.
If citizens want their rights, they're going to have to speak up and understand that.
Yeah.
Understand that this case is not just about Omar Khadr. It's about the rights of all Canadian citizens.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. It's almost be the last place I want to contact if I'm in trouble overseas, in some ways.
I have to tell you that you probably are somebody who would benefit from the discretion of the Canadian government, as would I.
Yeah.
Your name's not Omar.
Right. Good point. So it's not being applied consistently.
Yeah, certainly many people benefit from it currently.
Yeah.
If you are in trouble abroad, by all means, you call the Canadian government. You've lost your passport; they'll help you replace it. Many people get the assistance of the Canadian government. It's just that it appears that the government is very insistent that it doles out that assistance on a purely discretionary basis.
Yeah, interesting, very interesting. Thank you so much, Professor Macklin. For more FDA TV broadcasts, please visit democracychange.org. Thank you very much for tuning in.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.